historic day. Following Kodo's departure from the blood-soaked room where his confrontation with Ruda had come to a dramatic conclusion, a strange and unsettling silence settled over the continent. Ruda, Durika, and their son Randu vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that baffled both allies and adversaries alike. Their sudden disappearance cast a shadow of uncertainty over the turbulent political landscape, with no clear answers as to their whereabouts or intentions. As the days passed, the resistance movement, now free from the grip of Ruda's oppressive regime, turned to Kodo as their hero and leader. His role in toppling the formidable reign of Ruda had earned him the unwavering loyalty of the people, who elected him as their new president. In a momentous address to a gathering of supporters, Kodo stood before the crowd, his voice filled with the gravity of the occasion. "Today marks a historic day where justice triumphs over injustice," Kodo declared, his words resonating with a deep sense of purpose. "We waged a just war against oppressive rule, and we emerged victorious. This victory is dedicated to those who sacrificed their lives for this cause. Let us honor their courage and be grateful for the peace we enjoy today. Peace will be restored across this continent, and democracy shall be reinstated. I urge everyone to observe a moment of silence in remembrance of the fallen." The atmosphere grew solemn as the crowd bowed their heads, the weight of their collective grief and gratitude palpable in the air. The silence echoed through the assembly, a tribute to the brave souls who had given everything in the fight for freedom. After his speech, Kodo returned to his office, where a general entered, seeking his guidance on the next steps. "Your Holiness, President," the general began, his tone respectful yet urgent, "there are still two countries adhering to Ruda's oppressive rule. What should we do?" Kodo, ever decisive, responded without hesitation. "I comprehend the situation. Hyaenia and Leopardia still endure dictatorship, and their people suffer greatly under the yoke of tyranny. Our democracy will be a welcome change for them. Here's the plan: mobilize 5 legions, and launch a direct assault on Hyaenia. Once Hyaenia falls, conquering Leopardia will become more feasible. However, we must proceed with caution and ensure that the transition to democracy is smooth and without unnecessary bloodshed." The general nodded, understanding the gravity of the mission. "Understood, President. We shall execute your orders swiftly and efficiently," he affirmed, before leaving to rally the troops for the upcoming campaign. As preparations for the military offensive against Hyaenia and Leopardia began in earnest, Kodo also turned his attention to diplomatic efforts. He reached out to neighboring countries, seeking their support and cooperation in the endeavor to bring democracy to the oppressed nations. Through skillful negotiation and the forging of strategic alliances, Kodo secured vital backing from key allies, bolstering the resistance's military and logistical strength for the battles to come. In parallel with the military buildup, Kodo focused on rebuilding the war-torn regions under his control. He directed resources toward infrastructure projects, humanitarian aid, and initiatives to heal the wounds left by the conflict. For Kodo, it was essential not only to demonstrate his leadership on the battlefield, but also to show his commitment to peace, stability, and prosperity in the aftermath of war. As the day of the assault on Hyaenia approached, Kodo once again addressed the nation, his words a rallying cry for the next phase of their struggle. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice filled with conviction, "the time has come to extend the reach of justice and liberty to those who have long languished under the oppressive rule of tyranny. We stand on the cusp of history, poised to rewrite the narrative of our continent and usher in a new era of democracy and prosperity. Together, we shall march forward with unwavering resolve, united in our commitment to uphold the values of freedom, equality, and justice for all." The crowd erupted into fervent applause, their cheers reverberating through the streets. The people's faith in Kodo was unwavering, their spirits emboldened by his words. The nation braced itself for the challenges ahead, ready to confront the forces of tyranny and oppression with courage and determination. As the legions prepared to march on Hyaenia, Kodo's vision of a free and just continent seemed within reach. But even as the gears of war turned, he knew that the true test of his leadership lay not just in the battles that awaited, but in the promise of a lasting peace, a peace built on the foundations of democracy, justice, and the indomitable will of the people. The final reckoning in Hyaenia. Kodo's 5 legions surged into Hyaenia with unstoppable force, their precision and determination leaving little room for resistance. The antiquated forces of Hyaenia, ill-equipped and poorly trained, crumbled rapidly before the modern weaponry and tactical superiority of the guerrillist army. Though Jus, the tyrant ruler of Hyaenia, had anticipated the invasion through his corrupt intelligence network, the sheer might and speed of Kodo's forces caught him off guard. For Kodo, the invasion of Hyaenia served a dual purpose. Publicly, it was a mission to liberate the oppressed, to bring democracy and prosperity to a land long ruled by fear and cruelty. But beneath the surface, Kodo harbored a more personal vendetta, a deep-seated desire to avenge the deaths of his parents, to dismantle the corrupt regime that had brought so much suffering to his family and countless others. Balancing these motivations was a challenge, one that required Kodo to maintain the moral high ground even as the thirst for retribution threatened to consume him. The invasion, which began with a ferocity that left the Hyaenian forces reeling, quickly turned into a decisive campaign. Over the course of a month, Kodo's legions pressed forward with minimal losses, their disciplined approach breaking through every line of defense Jus forces could muster. Town by town, city by city, Hyenia's military crumbled, leaving the path to the capital, Vahan, wide open. As Kodo's forces marched triumphantly into Vahan, the end of Jus' reign seemed inevitable. The remnants of the Hyenian army were scattered, their will to fight broken by the relentless advance of the guerrillist troops. With the capital under siege and the regime's last stronghold, the presidential palace, surrounded, the moment of reckoning was at hand. In the midst of the final preparations, Kodo called his generals to assess the situation. "How many remain inside the palace?" he asked, his voice cold with determination. The lead general, after a brief pause, answered, "Approximately 20, Mr. President. They are highly skilled marksmen, trained to defend the palace to the last man." Kodo nodded, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the information. "I will confront them alone," he declared, his voice steady and resolute. The general's eyes widened in shock. "Impossible, Mr. President," he responded urgently. "These are professional assassins, ruthless and without mercy. Please reconsider. We can deploy a unit. 200 soldiers could storm the palace and eliminate them in minutes." But Kodo was unyielding. "No," he replied firmly. "This is a personal matter. I will face it alone." The general, recognizing the futility of further argument, reluctantly conceded. "As you wish, Mr. President," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. With his decision made, Kodo prepared himself for the final confrontation. Clad in battle-worn armor, his machete gleaming in the dim light, Kodo set out for the presidential palace. As he walked through the war-torn streets of Vahan, the weight of his mission pressed heavily upon him. He whispered to the blade in his hand, "Jus will see you soon." The city, now eerily quiet, bore the scars of war, buildings reduced to rubble, streets littered with debris, the air heavy with the stench of smoke and blood. Yet amidst the destruction, there was a palpable sense of anticipation, as if the very city itself was holding its breath in expectation of what was to come. Kodo reached the palace gates, now standing ajar, their ornate carvings marred by the signs of battle. The once magnificent palace, a symbol of just power and tyranny, now seemed to cower in the shadow of its impending doom. Without hesitation, Kodo stepped inside, his senses alert, every fiber of his being prepared for the final showdown. The last stand of the hyenas. In the dimly lit mansion, shadows danced along the walls as Jus paced the room, his thoughts a maelstrom of regret and desperate calculations. The weight of his past sins bore down on him, and as the walls seemed to close in, he felt the inescapable presence of retribution drawing nearer. A devoted hyena, ever loyal, approached him with a mixture of concern and urgency in its eyes. "Master," the hyena urged, its voice low but insistent, "the guerrillist army has surrounded us. There's still time. We must leave now, before it's too late." Jus, his face etched with the lines of a life spent in the shadows, paused to consider the words. The prospect of escape was tempting, but the realization of his age and the countless lives he had destroyed weighed heavily on him. He let out a weary sigh, his voice carrying the burden of his years. Run? To where? The sins of my past will follow me wherever I go. Perhaps today is the day I pay for them. The hyena, refusing to abandon its master, stepped closer. Then let me stand by your side, master. I won't leave you to face this alone. A flicker of something akin to gratitude passed through Jess' eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a grim determination. From a window, he spotted a figure leaping over the gate with an almost supernatural grace, a figure that filled him with both curiosity and a growing sense of dread. Who dares to enter my domain alone? Jess muttered to himself, his eyes narrowing as he strained to make out the intruder. Could it be that this one has the spirit of a tiger, as the old legends speak of? The 4 hyenas stationed at the gate reacted immediately, their submachine guns at the ready. But the stranger moved with a fluidity that defied belief. In the blink of an eye, the first hyena fell, its head severed cleanly from its body by the gleaming machete in the intruder's hand. Blood sprayed across the ground as the others hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough to seal their fates. The second hyena barely had time to raise its weapon before a powerful punch crushed its skull, sending it crumpling to the floor. The third lunged forward, only to be met with a devastating kick to the head, its brain shattered by the force of the blow. And the fourth, despite its desperate lunge, was dispatched with a swift knee to the chest, its life extinguished in an instant. Inside the mansion, Jess' eyes widened in disbelief. "Who is this demon?" he whispered, his voice tinged with fear. But the battle was far from over. As Kodo entered the mansion, he was met by over 10 more hyenas, each armed and ready to defend their master. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire as bullets whizzed past Kodo, tearing through the walls and furniture. Yet Kodo moved like a phantom, evading the deadly hail with preternatural agility. His machete became an extension of his will, cutting through the air with lethal precision. The first wave of hyenas fell quickly, their limbs and heads severed by Kodo's merciless strikes. Blood splattered the walls as Kodo moved through them, his expression cold and unyielding. Despite his best efforts, a few bullets found their mark, grazing his shoulder and arm, the pain searing through his body. But Kodo pressed on, his resolve unwavering. "Master," a surviving hyena shouted, panic in its voice as it witnessed Kodo's relentless advance. "We can't stop him." Just clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "Fall back to the inner sanctum," he ordered, desperation creeping into his tone. "We'll make our stand there." But Kodo was relentless. As the last group of hyenas retreated, he pursued them with single-minded determination. The corridors of the mansion became a battleground, the walls echoing with the sounds of combat. One by one, the remaining hyenas fell, their bodies left crumpled and broken in Kodo's wake. Finally, the last of the hyenas lay defeated, the mansion eerily silent except for the sound of Kodo's heavy breathing. He paused, taking a moment to assess his injuries. Blood trickled from his wounds, staining the floor beneath him, but the pain only fueled his determination. With a final glance at the fallen, Kodo tightened his grip on the machete and pushed forward, deeper into the mansion. He knew that the endgame was near, that Jess was close. The path was clear, but the final confrontation awaited, and Kodo would face it with the same unwavering resolve that had carried him this far. The battle was won, but the war, his war, was not yet over. Echoes of blood and memory. Kodo stepped into the dimly lit room where Jess waited, his presence like a specter from a past that refused to be forgotten. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost palpable as the two men faced each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like a shroud. The crimson stains on Kodo's clothes told the story of the battle that had brought him here, a tapestry woven from the blood of both himself and the hyenas he had vanquished to reach this moment. Jess turned slowly to face him, his gaze sharp and penetrating, eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the man who had stormed his stronghold. His voice, a low growl laced with suspicion, cut through the silence. "Who are you? Who sent you?" Kodo's lips curled into a smile that held 1,000 secrets, each one a silent testament to the tangled web of fate that had once again brought them together. "Don't you remember me?" he asked, his voice a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of time itself, as if the walls of the room were listening, waiting for the truth to be revealed. Jess' eyes flickered with confusion, a ripple that passed over his features but left him eerily composed. His demeanor was unwavering, a man who had seen too much to be easily shaken, even in the face of an unknown enemy. "Speak," he commanded, his tone brooking no refusal, as if he could will the truth out of Kodo by sheer force. Kodo stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Jess, as he delivered the words that would change everything. "Recall the assassination of President Natsu," he urged, his words heavy with the weight of history, each one dredging up memories buried beneath layers of deception and betrayal. Jess' eyes widened in sudden recognition, as the past came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. The storm of realization darkened his gaze. "It's you," he murmured, his voice a mixture of bitterness and grudging respect. "I can't forget. You wounded me during that mission." Jess' memory traveled back to that fateful day, when he had seen Kodo from a distance, just 20 meters away, before his comrades had whisked him away on a waiting motorbike, the scene of chaos and carnage fading behind him. But even as the memory played out in his mind, Jess could sense that there was more, something deeper that Kodo had yet to reveal. "And Kaki?" Kodo pressed, his voice sharp with accusation, a challenge thrown down like a gauntlet. "Does that name stir any recollection?" Jess pondered, his brow furrowing as he searched his memory for the connection. The name was familiar, yet elusive, like a half-remembered dream. "Familiar, but elusive," he admitted, his curiosity piqued. "Give me a hint." Kodo's anger flared, a searing fire that burned bright within him, pushing him to demand the truth. "Hewers tasked you with Kaki's demise over 40 years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion, each word a knife edge cutting into the past. "Remember?" Recognition dawned on Jess' face, and he chuckled, a cold, calculating sound that sent chills down Kodo's spine. "Ah, yes. Kaki, the man who defied bullets, slipping through my grasp like water through clenched fists," he mused, the memory now clear in his mind. "One of many victims. But Kaki," Kodo's voice cracked with the weight of grief and loss that he had carried for so long, "was my blood. My biological father. Zeon, my true name. You slew my father, and my grief-stricken mother followed him into death." His confession hung in the air between them, a lament for all that had been lost, a plea for justice that could never be fully realized. Jess stared at Kodo, the reality of their shared history sinking in. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls bearing witness to the confrontation of two men bound by fate and blood, enemies forged in the crucible of the past. Blood and memories intertwined in that moment, the echoes of history reverberating through the silence, a haunting reminder of all that had come before and all that was yet to come. Kodo stood tall, his machete still clutched in his hand, the blade gleaming with the promise of retribution. But in his eyes, there was something more, a deep, abiding sorrow, a yearning for closure that even the death of this man before him could not bring. Jess, seeing this, could only nod, a grim acknowledgement of the path that had led them both here. "So, this is how it ends," he said, his voice devoid of fear, filled instead with a resigned acceptance of the fate he had long avoided. "I always knew it would come to this." Kodo tightened his grip on the machete, the final words of his father echoing in his mind, urging him to be strong, to do what must be done. "Yes, Jess," he whispered, "it ends here." In that moment, the battle of wills between them reached its zenith. The years of pain, the longing for vengeance, and the ghosts of the past all culminated in this room, as Kodo prepared to deliver the final, fateful strike. The final reckoning. In the dimly lit room, shadows twisted and turned as two figures stood locked in a deadly confrontation, the air heavy with the promise of vengeance. Jess, the infamous assassin whose name was synonymous with fear, stood his ground, his eyes cold and calculating. Opposite him was Kodo, his machete gleaming with the sharp edge of retribution, his heart ablaze with the need to avenge the wrongs done to him and his family. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of their shared past, each man knowing that only one would walk away from this encounter. Without warning, the silence was shattered by the thunderous sound of gunfire. Jess, true to his nature, had drawn his weapon in a flash, sending a hail of bullets toward Kodo with deadly precision. But Kodo was ready. Years of honing his skills had made him faster, stronger, and more resilient than ever before. With a swift, fluid motion, he raised his machete, the blade cutting through the air to intercept the deadly projectiles. Each bullet met the cold steel with a sharp clang, sparks flying as Kodo advanced, his eyes never leaving his target. In a heartbeat, Kodo was upon him. With the ferocity of a storm, he brought his machete down in a deadly arc, the blade slicing through the air with unerring accuracy. The sharp edge met flesh and bone, severing Jess' right arm in a single, brutal strike. Blood sprayed across the room, painting the walls with the crimson mark of battle, but Jess did not flinch. His face remained a mask of calm indifference, as if the loss of his limb meant nothing to him. But Jess was not finished. With a calculated move, he reached under the table with his remaining hand, his fingers closing around the grip of a hidden gun. He aimed the weapon at Kodo, his eyes narrowing with cold intent as his finger tightened on the trigger. But Kodo was faster. With another powerful swing of his machete, Kodo severed Jess' left arm, the blade cleaving through flesh and bone with a sickening crunch. Jess fell to the ground, blood pouring from his wounds, pooling around him as he struggled to stay upright. His strength was ebbing away with each passing second, but his spirit remained unbroken. Even in the face of death, Jess' eyes burned with a fierce intensity, a defiant fire that refused to be extinguished. "I have done so many cruel things in my life," Jess whispered, his voice a raspy breath in the stillness of the room. "Earth-shattering things. Perhaps history will remember my name as the most cruel person in humanity." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his past deeds. Kodo stood over him, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared down at the man who had caused him so much pain. Memories of his father, his mother, and the life that had been stolen from him flashed before his eyes, each one a reminder of the darkness that Jess had brought into the world. Echoes of Ray. In the dim, blood-soaked room, the final breaths of Jess, the once feared assassin, came in shallow, ragged gasps. As the life drained from his body, his mind drifted back to a single name that had been the anchor of his thoughts, the source of his torment, and the fuel for his relentless cruelty: Ray. Ray. The name escaped Jess' lips in a desperate whisper, a cry of longing and despair that reverberated through the silence of the room. His voice, once a weapon of command and intimidation, now trembled with a vulnerability that belied the hardened exterior he had cultivated over decades. In those final moments, all the bloodshed, all the ruthless ambition, faded into the background, leaving only the image of a woman who had never returned his love. Ray. Her name was a melody that had played on a loop in Jess' mind, a haunting refrain that had accompanied him through every dark deed, every act of violence. She was the one thing he had desired but could never possess, the one pure thing in his life that he had yearned for with an intensity that bordered on obsession. As the world around him blurred, Jess' vision cleared, and he saw her, Ray. She stood before him, as beautiful as he remembered, her figure ethereal and distant, like a ghost from another life. She was dressed in white, her movements graceful as she danced in the twilight of his consciousness. Her laughter, a sound he had never been able to forget, echoed in his ears, soft and musical, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of his existence. Ray's dark, flowing hair cascaded down her shoulders, framing a face that was etched into Jess' memory, a face that had been the source of both his greatest joy and his deepest sorrow. Her eyes, full of life and warmth, looked through him, never at him. Even now, in the throes of death, Jess knew that those eyes had never held any love for him. His heart ached with a longing so profound it felt as if it would tear him apart. In life, he had never been able to turn her gaze towards him, never been able to make her see him as anything more than a shadow on the periphery of her world. She had loved another, and that unrequited love had driven Jess to the edge of madness, fueling his cruelty, his desire to destroy everything that reminded him of the happiness he could never have. Ray, he called out again, his voice cracking with the weight of his despair. He reached out, his bloodied hands trembling as he tried to grasp the vision before him, but his fingers met only empty air. She continued to dance, oblivious to his suffering, her image growing fainter as the darkness closed in around him. Kodo, watching the scene unfold, felt a pang of unexpected sorrow as he raised his machete. He had seen many men die, but none with such a look of regret in their eyes. Jess, the man who had wreaked havoc on so many lives, was now just a broken soul, chasing the memory of a woman who had never been his. In one swift, merciful motion, Kodo swung his machete. The blade swept through the air, its sharp edge catching the light one last time before it found its mark. Jess' head fell to the ground, his eyes still wide open, locked in that final vision of Ray, her face the last thing he saw, her name the last word on his lips. As the room fell silent, the echoes of Ray's dance lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the man Jess might have been, had love not eluded him. In the end, it was not power, nor vengeance, nor even the blood of his enemies that consumed Jess. It was love, unreturned and unfulfilled, that haunted him to his final breath.